All right, well, guess I'll get started. Hopefully you're all in the right place and didn't just stumble in accidentally. The way this is going to work, I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes, maybe 20. And then I want to open it up afterwards to questions and answers, because I find that's always the most fun at these types of events. If you did not get a handout, there are some on the end. On the front side, you'll find an outline which gives you sort of the skeleton of what I'm going to talk about. Certain points on the outline have numbered parentheses, or parenthetical numbers, which refer to quotes that can be found on the back part of my outline. Those quotes are to help flesh out and expand upon anything that I might not get to touch upon in the allotted time. So let's dive right in. The psychologist Abraham Maslow has this quote that goes, "Organized religion can be thought of as an effort to communicate peak experiences to non-peakers, to teach them and to apply them." What Abraham Maslow is doing is he's creating a model of religion which focuses on the individual's experiences, specifically their transcendent experiences, and how this serves as a framework for the rest of religion at large. We can find evidence to corroborate this model by Maslow if we look to the world's major religions. For example, Christianity and the biblical traditions have the revelations of Moses, various other prophets, as well as the conversion of Paul on the road to Damascus. Islam has the revelations of Muhammad. Buddhism has the enlightenment of Siddhartha, so forth and so on. Now, the philosopher William James also took this approach to studying religion. For James, he wanted to study it from a psychological point of view. And to do that, he wanted to study what he called the eccentrics, those people for whom which religion was an acute fever and not a dull habit. And he does this in his text, The Varieties of Religious Experience. What's important to note off the bat is that James did not entitle it The Monotony of Religious Experience. He did this because obviously there are at least, well, he found there are three orders of differentiation, what we might call three dimensions of variety. The first variety is that of induction. That is, not all mystical experiences are spontaneous. A lot of them are deliberately induced, so they can be induced by prayer, yoga, meditation, flagellation, substance intoxication, sensory deprivation, fasting, rhythmic drumming, tantric sex, so forth and so on. Some of these sound a little more fun than others. The second dimension of differentiation is that of phenomenology. What you quickly discover when reading the accounts of these mystics is that each expression is determined by the tempo, spatial, and cultural context out of which that experience arose. So obviously Christian mystics aren't using the same words or the same expressions that Buddhist monks were. So the content, you could say, is framed by the context out of which it came. The third order of differentiation is that of intensity. Not all mystical experiences are boundary-dissolving conversations with the Godhead at the end of the universe. Some of them are much more manageable, much more subtle, much more nuanced. And what James discovered, and this is extremely important, is that there are all sorts of intermediary states between normal consciousness and mystical consciousness. And these intermediary states point to a connection between the normal mind and the mystical mind, so that they're not separate as we might think them to be, and that our normal consciousness is only the exaggeration of certain faculties that gives us the mystical mind. And that, I think, is what connects the variety, those three dimensions of variety, is that they all have their roots in normal consciousness. So I want to argue that altered states of consciousness, specifically the mystical experience, are the exaggeration of the following four features. The first of which is ego dissolution. Ego dissolution is nothing more than the complete absorption of your attention into the activity at hand, so that the contents of your mind become identical with the contents of your experience, and the self no longer has any room within your attention. A good example of this is sexual ecstasy. Not always done right, but when it is, you and your partner have this experience where your boundaries dissolve and you merge into one another, and your sense of I is lost for a sense of us or we. And you can see that if you just exaggerate that a millionfold, you get this experience which mystics describe of joining with the union with the universe, or with God. The second feature is time dilation, which is just a technical term for what we might more spiritually call eternity. Now, as far as I understand it, the difference between infinity and eternity is that infinity is unending time, time as far as the eye can see and beyond. Eternity is the ability to step outside the temporal flow, so that hours and minutes pass by with equal ease. You're no longer subject to that temporal flow. A good example of this can be found in what the psychologist Csikszentmihalyi calls flow. This quality of time dilation is an important aspect of an experience that he found often present in athletic experiences, so something that pushes your body instead of pushing your mind. The third order is that of integration of our unconscious. Now, the unconscious has been stigmatized and slanderized since Freud, and much due to Freud, as sort of a warehouse or a cellar for all our evil, baser, not quite pleasant instincts, more of our violent tendencies. Which, and because of that, because of this aversion to our unconscious, a lot of us deliberately shut ourselves off from it. But when you do that, when you cut yourself off from the hell within, you're also cutting yourself off from the heaven within. And a good example of this is aesthetics. And anyone that's into aesthetics knows that a lot of times your source of inspiration, your source of creativity, comes from not a deliberate trying, but a deliberate letting go, and just seeing what bubbles to the surface and letting go so that something else can take you over. A good example of this is the jazz musician who improvises and just lets the reins go. The fourth aspect is what I call non-Aristotelian logic. Aristotelian logic rests on the proposition that an object cannot be both A and not A at the same time. It has to be one or the other. Well, and this makes sense in our day-to-day lives and on a certain level. The problem is that Aristotelian logic is not comprehensive and does not account for certain anomalies. So obviously, I cannot be both in front of you and behind you at the same time. I have to be either one or the other. The problem is that Aristotelian logic creates dichotomies where there are none. So we have the dichotomies of good and evil, spiritual and earthly, free will and determinism, so forth and so on. Furthermore, if we look at the new sort of frontier of science, quantum mechanics, we're beginning to sort of deconstruct this Aristotelian logic that it was rested upon. Phenomenon like entanglement and non-locality sort of pick apart and cause us to question this either-or logic of Aristotle's. So when you enter an altered state of consciousness, I argue that you can substitute this either-or logic with a both-and, so you can transcend the dichotomies and see things with multiple layers of meaning. A good example of this is in dreams, where you encounter what might be called visual puns. And what makes a pun is that it has multiple meanings at the same time. The meaning does not flicker between A or B. It is A and B and C and D, and so forth and so on. And so dreams are a good example because oftentimes you encounter figures that might be multiple people at the same time, or multiple landscapes, or so forth and so on. Now you can already see that we've somewhat transitioned from the psychological to the philosophical. I want to point you to the quote by Aldous Huxley, the sixth one, which is really important. I'm going to read it out loud. The quote goes, "Knowledge is a function of being. When there is a change in the being of the knower, there is a corresponding change in the nature and the amount of knowing." What Huxley is doing with this quote is he's drawing a direct connection between the object of knowledge and that person that is doing the knowing, so that the observed and the observer are inextricably bound together. And when you change the quality of the observer, you're also changing the quality and the content of the object observed. So using this as a basis, we can talk about altered states of consciousness, specifically mystical states, as by analogy being similar to software or tools that we have in our computer. So we have in our computer different programs which allow us to manipulate, organize, and deal with data in different ways. So we don't obviously use Photoshop to edit audio input, nor do we use Microsoft Word to edit visual input. So each program deals with information in its own way. If we can think of states of consciousness in the same way as programs, then I think that we can deconstruct what is known as the single state fallacy. And the single state fallacy is the assumption that consciousness only has one legitimate road to knowledge, and that is the rational mode. But if we use this analogy of programs or software, we can see that altered states can be tools for discovery. So in much the same way that the telescope revolutionized astronomy, in the same way that the microscope revolutionized biology, I think that altered states of consciousness can revolutionize psychology. And it's important here because altered states of consciousness do not necessarily contradict the facts of normal states of consciousness. Rather, just like our programs, we can layer them upon one another so that there's no contradiction between the two, but we may rise to a higher, more encompassing viewpoint. So it's not, mystical consciousness isn't about seeing different things. It's about seeing things differently, which is important. So just to wrap up here, consciousness is fundamental to the way that we interact with the world. It is the one thing that is present from birth till death and that we cannot escape. It is at once our liberator and our prisoner. But if we realize that reality is a consequence of the lens viewing it, and if we become the masters rather than the slaves of our lens, then I truly believe that we can reclaim our consciousness, we can reclaim reality, and ultimately, we can reclaim and redefine spirituality. Thank you.